All right, good afternoon. My name is Kevin Carpenter. I'm a volunteer at CPPCon, and I get the fortunate job of being able to interview some of these speakers and such before the convention and get more details about what they're going to be doing. Today I have Bob Stiegel with me. He has a very, very busy conference coming up between being poster chair, pre-conference classes, and I think you've got 2 talks in there as well.
That's correct. I have 2 talks this year.
So why don't you go give us some background on yourself there, Bob?
Well, the nickel story is that I became aware of C++ in I think it was around 1992. I was working as a research assistant at University Hospitals in Cleveland and Case Western Reserve University, and I was working for a professor who was in radiology doing MRI, and I was trying to write some image processing software, and I was using C and was having problems with data structures and memory leaks, and I saw this thing called C++, and I bought Bjarne's book, second edition, from the university bookstore. I started reading it, and at the time, I was very procedurally oriented with a big background in C and Fortran and Pascal and BASIC. And I looked at it and thought, this is madness. I put it away, sat on the shelf for about 6 months, and then I pulled it off the shelf again. I started reading it, and I learned about this thing called the destructor and RAII and scope-based resource control, and suddenly the light bulb went on, and I thought, hey, I can do cool stuff with this. And this was before there was the STL. There were other popular container classes and libraries that we used at the time. And I left University Hospitals a couple years later to start my own business. We're living in Cleveland, Ohio. In the mid and late 90s, I actually wrote and sold to a very small number of people an independent version of the standard library, which was more or less conformant to C++ 98. I don't think I ever even got to 100 customers, but it was a good learning experience. My wife got a job at the National Institute of Health, and we moved to the Maryland area. And I returned to medical imaging and ran a medical imaging company for a few years, and then bounced around a little bit since then. Currently now working in distributed stream processing. And I would say 95% of the code I've written over the last 26 years has been C++.
Right on. So I can imagine with medical imaging, that is a lot of, processing intensive application and performance and stuff.
Yes.
Any fun things with that?
I did a lot of work about 10 years ago writing a some fairly extensive metaprogramming facilities that probably would be similar to Boost MPL. At the time, the company I was working for had an extremely strict policy against taking in open source software. The policy was no open source software. So a lot of the things that I might have used from things like Boost, I couldn't. I ended up having to do myself, and that was a good learning experience. We did things like I built a linear algebra library, which was a set of nice wrappers to the Intel math kernel library to get the performance we needed. I did work that touched on writing user interfaces that are actually used on scanners, or they were, doing things like running the prescription of a scan when the technologist enters parameters for a patient, image display, I was the manager of a team that varied between 8 and 15 people, and I was chief cook and bottle washer. I got to do design, and I also got to put soap in the dispensers in the bathroom. So that kind of job. It's a lot of fun. I miss it. I miss my team.
I can imagine. So talking about interfaces and such, that kind of fits in with your class that's going on before the conference?
Yes, that's right. This year, I'm going to be teaching a 2-day pre-conference class on interface design for C++. I call it Interface Design for Modern C++. And the class is intended to be, or is targeted towards, I guess, less experienced programmers, people who might consider themselves to be advanced beginners or intermediate level programmers who are sort of have gained and experienced the basics of the language, who understand pointers and references and move semantics versus copy semantics, and are now at the point to where they would like to create their own libraries, either for personal projects or professionally, and want to start writing their own APIs. And that can be a very daunting task. And so the purpose of the talk, or the class, is to provide some wisdom, to provide a set of tools that these programmers can use in developing their own APIs. It's really sort of a distillation of best practices, both from lots of other people besides me, as well as my own experiences in writing several libraries over the last 26 years, in hopes that they'll avoid some of the mistakes that I made and be able to create good libraries quicker than I did at that point in my career.
I can understand that. I also noticed that it's one of those ones where you're saying bring your laptop, so I'm guessing it's a bit of a hands-on class too?
Yes, it's designing interfaces. It's not necessarily writing implementations, right? I'm the kind of guy that has a very, I believe in a very strict divide between interface and implementation. And I think, the interface is often the most important part of the product. It provides the contract that users of the product employ to use it. It makes the promises that the product will fulfill. And getting that right is a lot more difficult, I think, than people give it credit for. And the point of the class is to teach students how to think about these issues, how to think about, what is this thing that I'm trying to represent? What is the problem? What is the solution to the problem? How do I express the solution to the problem in a clean and elegant way? And then finally, once I've done all of that, how do I tell the world about it so the rest of the world can use it? Because, ultimately, you have to pass that knowledge on to the customer so they can use the great thing that you've just finished writing.
And I have to say, I'd even considered the class too. I'm unfortunate that I only get one weekend class to take, but I actually come from a background of where we're converting old Power Builder code, if you will. And so separation of concerns and things like that from 15 years ago was not exactly a priority. So it seemed to me that your class would have been beneficial for me that way as well.
Well, thank you. I'll miss you.
I'll have to catch you afterwards.
As far as the laptops go, we're not going to be writing and compiling and executing code, but it's more of a tool to help people work through the exercises, just putting together, class definitions without actually writing any implementation code. And I hope to have people maybe work in small teams or individually to solve some problems, and then, it would be interactive in that we apply the criteria that the class expresses or recommends, and sort of gently critique each other's work in an effort to, flex those muscles a little bit before going out and doing it for real.
It's always nice to get good feedback. I mean, at least for me, that's how I learn.
Right.
So aside from the classes, then you also have a couple talks you're giving, right?
Yes, I'm giving two talks. One is called Fancy Pointers for Fun and Profit, which is a talk about synthetic pointers and alternative addressing models. I believe that one is Tuesday morning. And then Wednesday morning, I'm giving a talk on fast UTF-8 conversion using DFAs and SSE intrinsics. Going in the other order, the UTF-8 talk just falls out of some work I was doing about 18 months ago, where I was under the temporary illusion that I was going to write my own JSON parsing implementation. And in studying the JSON spec, I realized that it needed to be able to handle UTF-8 at a minimum. And so in order to handle UTF-8, I decided to dig into it. And I saw this sort of interesting problem in that, you have this sequence of bytes, and you have criteria, rules that describe what are valid and invalid sequences. And you convert those sequences of groups of bytes to, say, char 32T, which represents a code point. And The interesting problem is how can you do that as quickly as possible? And, at the end of the day, I don't really care what it gets used for. I was interested in how can I make the conversion fast and cool. And so I settled on sort of this hybrid algorithm that uses DFAs, like you might use in a Lexer, a state machine. It traverses a state machine and builds the code point incrementally from the code units. In the case where you have non-ASCII characters or non-ASCII code points, and in the other cases where you have lots of ASCII code points, it uses SSE to do zero extension very quickly. And as it turns out, it can be pretty fast. I have some benchmarks of articles that I took from Wikipedia, the Hindi language described in Russian, right? Or the Japanese language described in Korean, or things like that, right?
Right.
And, the algorithm performs very well, especially against the things that are considered standard. It performs very well because a lot of the times there's a lot of characters that are ASCII, and especially in web pages. You have these long runs of ASCII pages where you can take advantage of the SSE speed up. So that was nice. It was a nice little problem. The Tuesday morning talk is on fancy pointers, or synthetic pointers, I like to call them. And these are things that the standard calls pointer-like types. And they're objects that emulate pointers. And they can be used to address memory in non-traditional ways, like shared memory. If you have a shared memory segment and two processes are accessing that shared memory segment might be mapped to a different address in each of the two processes. Well, if you want to build data structures in the shared memory segment, and you want to use pointers in your shared memory segment, the representation of those pointers have to be independent of the address of the shared memory segment. So how do you do that? Well, you do that with synthetic pointers. And so the talk will briefly talk about the motivation for synthetic pointers, give a couple of problems and a couple of examples at the end, probably with a couple of live code walkthroughs just to demonstrate that it actually works.
That one I am looking forward to. So I also understand that you have the posters.
Yes, so that's another interesting story. I was at C++ Now in Aspen last year, 2017, and at the opening reception, I bumped into John Kalb, and I asked him, "Hey, John, is there anything that needs to be done for CPPCon this September? Do you need any extra help?" And he looks at me and he says, "Well, I've got this poster program I need somebody to run because Hanya can't do it anymore. Would you be interested in doing that?" And, he kind of looks at you with those sad eyes, and ultimately you end up saying yes. So I ran the poster program last year. We went from 4 posters in 2016 to 9 posters last year. This year we have 16 posters. So we've experienced an average compound annual growth rate of 100%. If I double it 3 more times, I'll have as many posters as there are talks. And actually, we had more than 16 submissions this year, but we had some that came in late, and just too late to accept, and I had to cut them off. But all of the posters, I think, are very interesting this year, as they were last year. I'm very much looking forward to reading them and meeting the poster authors. We have some, I think, that range from people who work for themselves to university associated. I'm not sure if they are professors or graduate students, but associated with universities, of course, to industry. I don't think we have any undergraduate students this year. Last year we had 2 posters that came from 3 students. But I'm really looking forward to it. It's very interesting.
I missed last year's CPPCon, but I do remember 2016 when the first time they did the posters with the 4, and they were awesome. So I'm really looking forward to seeing all the posters that were submitted this year, without a doubt.
Well, last year at the reception on Sunday evening, John and I had positioned the posters inside the reception area and just sort of in a random way. And I was very excited because so many people, a very large number of people showed up to the reception, and around every single poster, there were crowds that were 3 and 4 people deep listening to the authors talk about their posters. And I thought, that's great. That's so exciting for the authors because they're reaching all of these people. And the thing I like about posters is it's like a persistent medium, right? It's up all week. It doesn't disappear at the end of the talk. And you can always track down the author and talk to them about it. I think it's an excellent alternative way to communicate good C++ stuff at a conference like CPPCon. I'm really, I'm pretty psyched to be part of it, and I sort of like running it. So hopefully John will decide to keep me on.
I have to say I like that perspective because I hadn't considered that about the fact that you're right. They are always up, and so that is an excellent point. So you've obviously been going to the convention and been part of it for a few years. Do you have any recommendations for newcomers or people that are first coming to the conference of ways to make it the best?
Well, I will tell you, so I've been to CPPCon every year, starting in 2014. So I've been this will be the 5th one. I remember the first year there were 4 tracks, 4 simultaneous tracks, and I thought, this is too much. And of course, it's just gotten to be more and more every year. There's so much good material. There are authors that I would almost gladly skip out on my own talks to go watch that are up against me. There are talks Tuesday after mine. There are literally 4 different tracks of talks in the morning after mine, and I don't know which one to pick that I would go see. It is an embarrassment of riches. But I guess my advice to newcomers to the conference would be definitely, fill out your schedule that you can get to from the website on sked.com. Have a plan, and for each time slot, have your first, second, and third choice. Because, sometimes you show up at a talk and it's either way over your head or the speaker's not really talking about what you thought the speaker was going to talk about. It's important to have, a plan for each time slot. Definitely go to the lightning talks and the open content sessions in the evening. Those are great. They can be funny. It's not nearly as, I don't want to say stodgy, but it's not as regimented as the regular sessions. So, occasionally some pretty interesting stuff happens there, and it's a good forum, a good way to dip your toe in the water and see if you want to present your ideas to other people, in 5-minute increments.
It is a very interesting thing giving a lightning talk. I want to say it was 2015 that I did my first lightning talk. Kate had kind of recommended. I've been working with her, and it's an exciting thing. You get to get your feet wet. I will say I think it's harder sometimes to do a short talk versus a long, just because you're trying to compress into this small spot. But it was most enjoyable.
Yeah, I enjoy listening to them.
Well, that's what we were trying to cover today. I enjoyed speaking with you, and I look forward to seeing you at the convention.
All right, Kevin. Well, it was a pleasure to meet you, and thank you very much for having me on. It's been lots of fun, and make sure you find me or try to bump into me so we can actually meet in person.
That we will.
All right,
Have
Kevin.
a good day.
Thank you.